Thank you everyone for watching. Today we have a very special guest all the way from Kentucky, Rabbi Litvin. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You may know him as the clubhouse rabbi, also as the bluegrass rabbi, but without a doubt, wonderful rabbi. And this episode right now is being filmed before Purim, and that is also what I want to talk about, what happened before Purim, because the start of that story is pretty a remarkable circumstance. So how did we get there? Because to kind of refresh people's memories, the beginning of Purim, you have a displaced people celebrating. Like how did we get there?
So the famous Purim song is Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh hu Achashverosh, and it was in the days of King Achashverosh, who secular history refers to as Xerxes, but doesn't really say what happened. The Jews are all living in a foreign country. There's a foreign king over them. When we last left the Jews, that wasn't the case. So a little background information is needed if you want to understand the Purim story, especially as if we want to seek any lessons from it, we need to know the mind frame, the thought process of the Jews at that time. So little background information is extremely crucial to the story.
Yeah, because we're commanded to hear the story every year. So what are some clues to fill that big gaping hole in history?
So one of the crucial things that we talk about even in the Purim story, one of the reasons that Achashverosh, the king, was so happy, we talk about in Jewish history, was he believed the 70 years had passed since the Jews' exile. That's why one of the reasons he threw that giant party in the beginning of the story. So I think we'll start a little over 70 years ago, when the Jews first lost their right to rule themselves.
Purim, episode 1, starts 70 years. So we had 70 years ago, the Jews
this is episode 1. This is the prequel.
This is the prequel. Yeah, so 70 years ago, it was the second temple the Jews had, or it was the first temple?
No, the first temple.
The first temple. And how can you talk about the collapse? How did the Jews lose the first temple?
The temple was in a small country called Judea. Already a few generations earlier, the kingdom of the Jews had split into a larger kingdom called Israel, a smaller kingdom called Judea. Judea was still ruled by the Davidic line, the Davidic Empire. And in the Jewish year 3319, you want me to do the math as we go across?
I guess so, because this is YouTube. There's gonna be a lot of fact checkers and trolls, so we might have to do the math here. Yeah, no, that's tough when we get into the thousands.
462 years ago. Hold on 1 second. I'm sorry to go off camera.
Yeah, no, my mental computer is off.
So just so anyone can fact check me, what I'm using is the ultimate source to know Jewish dates, the Codex of the Codex Judaica Digest, which has all the dates on it. So I know the dates on the Jewish calendar, so I can translate them to the non-Jewish calendar to make it easier for people to fact check me. I'm going to pull this.
Because the story of Purim is a historical story.
Correct. It is a historical story. So, in 3319 is where our story begins. So 3319 translates to 442 before the Common Era.
So just a couple thousand years ago.
Just a hop, a skip, and a jump.
Yeah.
So, for those who are math geeks, it is exactly 2,462 years ago.
Wow.
So, at that time, a foreign king, the king of Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar, called in history Nebuchadnezzar, conquers the land of Judea. Now, at that time, he was king of a large portion of the known world, and he ruled often by vassal kings. So he kept the king of Judea in place, the Davidic king, and all he had to do was pay taxes to him on a regular basis. He had to acknowledge that Nebuchadnezzar was king, pay incredibly high taxes, and he was able to remain as king. Now, sadly, the Jews at this time, although they had the temple, many of them were worshiping idols. The spirituality of the Jewish people was in a state, while still far higher than today's, was in an ill state for that era of time.
And they were not
2 years after, correct. 2 years after Nebuchadnezzar took over the kingdom, there was a prophet who rose known to history as Jeremiah. Jews will call him Yirmiyahu. So as I always say, contrary to popular opinion, he was not a bullfrog. He was a man with a long white beard, and he predicted that this idea of the Jewish king bowing to the Babylonian king wouldn't work, and that the temple would be destroyed. Now, as you can imagine, this made him remarkably unpopular, especially among the ruling class. The ruling class told everyone, we got this handled. It's not perfect, but we've got this under control. And Yirmiyahu said exactly the opposite. Because of our sins, we'll be exiled from our land, that the temple will be destroyed. But 70 years later, the temple will be rebuilt. Again, he was ostracized for this view. This was a man at a time when the Jews still had it fairly okay, preaching doom, and many hated him for it. And indeed, 6 years later, so we're now on the Jewish calendar at 3327, 3328, on the non-Jewish calendar, 423 years before the Common Era, the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. The walls of Jerusalem are pierced, the king is overthrown, and Jerusalem is destroyed. So it began with, in 3327, Nebuchadnezzar ended the kings of Judea. He took the king, his name was Yechaniah, and he brought him to live in his palace as a hostage to the Jewish people. He not only took the king, he took the entire ruling class, the entire Davidic line.
Did he take the entire Sanhedrin as well?
He took the Sanhedrin, but the Davidic line, specifically in Judaism, is very important because it's the line of Mashiach. The belief of an eventual Redeemer comes from that line. So he conquered that entire line, and he took the entire Sanhedrin, the high court of the Jewish people. So the entire royal court,
so he was trying to cover his bases to say, no way, no possible, this prophecy will not happen. I have the king and anyone that could possibly be the king.
So that was two things. Number one, as a threat, and number two, to stop off a rebellion, who at that time would be a central enough figure to lead the rebellion. And then a year later, 11 months after the conquer, on the 9th of Av, the temple was destroyed. That day is still commemorated throughout the Jewish community as a day of sadness and mourning. Now, the Jews in Bavel didn't have it entirely terrible. Judaism was able to flourish under a certain state. The king had become extremely fond of one of the young men of the court. His name was Daniel, known to history as the prophet Daniel, and the king found him remarkable. Mostly, it says, he was a very on-the-surface guy. Daniel was a handsome-looking man, and the king was either attracted to him or admired him, especially because Daniel was a vegetarian almost at that time. There was no kosher meat available in the Babylonian court. So in one of the saddest episodes of Jewish history, the Jews had to be vegetarians. And, I think that goes up against almost any. But the king was amazed that someone who was eating so little could still maintain their lustrous look. So he allowed him to be one of the advisors in his court. He represented the Jewish people. And when Nebuchadnezzar had a remarkable dream, he woke up in a sweat. He had a dream of an enormous body made up of brass and clay and silver and iron, with a golden head, and it stepped on a pebble. The pebble grew into a mountain, and the body fell. And he was horrified by this dream. He clearly knew that the body was him, and he wasn't sure what he saw. And Daniel explained that there'd be 4 empires represented by those 4 elements that would try to rule over the Jews. They would be the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Mohammedan Empire, and the Roman Empire, which still rules the world today. People don't realize this, but America is a derivative of the Roman Empire, as the British Empire was. But that little pebble that they continuously step on, the Jewish people will one day grow into a mountain and will emerge victorious. So Nebuchadnezzar accepted this, and he was able to find some comfort. And he was so obsessed with this idea of him as the head of an empire that he built a sphinx-like idol, a giant lion which bore his face. There were actually replicas of this lion that Nebuchadnezzar made, still existed up until 5 years ago, when the wonderful leaders of ISIS decided to blow up the last one.
I was going to say some bomb might have gotten...
No, it was intentional. They said that any statue is an idol and all idols need to be destroyed. I don't know that Torah would have that much of a disagreement with them, but I do believe that most...
Might have been cleaner about it. Might have been cleaner about it.
Had severe issues with them destroying these idols, which had not been worshipped in thousands of years. And he commanded everyone who entered the palace to bow down to the idol. But Daniel, together with his 3 students, refused to bow down. Now, the anti-Semites at that time were realists. The same way that some anti-Semites today will use different words to describe Jews, globalists, Zionists, they don't go directly after Jews. So too, they realized that Daniel was a favorite of the king, so they didn't besmirch his honor, but Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his three students, they explained to the king they refused to bow to you, they're flaunting your authority. So the king had them thrown in a fire. And all three survived the fire. They walked around unscathed. And it was a clear acknowledgement of God still being with his people. That message was not lost on the leaders of the world. This episode went all around the world. Another episode happened later where Daniel himself was thrown famously to the lion's den, and he too was spared miraculously. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had a major inferiority complex that was only matched by Ahasuerus, we'll discuss later. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to go down in history as the greatest king of all time. One of the marks of a great king is wealth. So before his death, Nebuchadnezzar sank a great deal of his wealth into the sea so that his son would never be as rich as he was. Talk about reverse American dream. I want to make sure my son has it worse off than I do.
What a good dad.
Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by his son, Evil Modrach. Evil Modrach was often spelt in English E-V-I-L, so evil. He was actually the best of the Jews out of any Babylonian king. He was the first one to allow Yechaniah to leave prison and allow Jewish life to grow in Babylonia, although he would not allow the Jews to return to Israel.
So he was evil, but the food was nice.
Yeah. So compared to Nebuchadnezzar, his father, or Belshazzar, his son, he was actually a very good king. But the most important thing, both in Jewish and world history, that took place during his reign didn't even happen in his own country. In the East, there was an unwanted child who was left in the wilderness to die. The way that he told the story, and it was told in history, was he was raised by dogs. He went by the name Koresh, or Cyrus. Cyrus literally means son of a female dog, which is a popular expression in modern history. But he meant it as a badge of honor, that I was able to survive in the wild.
So the genesis of that word is positive. Interesting. It means king. So if I ever get in trouble, I was calling you a king. I wasn't insulting you, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll explain to that boss that I got fired by in high school that I never meant it in a bad way.
Yeah, you're calling you king. Like what? I should get a raise.
So he, growing up in the wilderness, became a bandit, and he was good at it. He was phenomenally physically gifted, as well as a brilliant tactician. And eventually robbing people became boring for him. So he began to rob under other thieves. They were always armed and ready to fight. It was more interesting. But eventually, the thieves realized they can't make a livelihood with Koresh robbing them all the time. So they all swore allegiance to him. He built the first mafia, the Persian mafia, the Median mafia, really. And then they started robbing the army, which was both well-fed and well-armed. And eventually the army, too, realized they couldn't fight off Koresh. So the king of the country, Darius, known to history as Darius I, made him a remarkable offer. I will let you marry my daughter. He only had a daughter. Iran, then as now, did not have remarkable rights for women. So I'll let you marry my daughter. You'll become king when I die, and you'll fight with my army instead of against my army. Koresh immediately accepted that remarkable offer, but again, he was a man that liked fighting. He enjoyed the battlefield. So he quickly took his father-in-law's army, combined it with the strength of his own men, who fought, as you can imagine, in a very different style than a trained army, but often when fighting alongside was a huge benefit, and began to fight across the world as the head of the Persian media military might. Now, several years later, in 3387, Evil-Modrach passed away, and Belshazzar, his son, became the king. That year, in the third year of his reign, so 3390, his advisors came to him with a remarkable realization. The prophet of the Jews, Jeremiah, said 70 years would go by, and then the Jews would replace to their land. And I know this has always been a paranoid fear among you, that this little stone, as your grandfather dreamt of, will overthrow your kingdom. And 70 years have gone by now. If you remember, it was 70 years earlier that Nebuchadnezzar had first conquered the country and made the king a vassal. So 70 years of Babylonian ownership of the land of Israel has now ended, which means the Jews will never return to their land. And Belshazzar was thrilled. He had been paranoid about this for a generation. He ordered a huge banquet to be made. He used the vessels of the holy temple. He was flaunting against God, you no longer have power here.
So
And
that's
that
why
night,
there's a banquet at the beginning of the Book of Esther.
we're not even at that banquet. This is the
There's a different banquet.
All kinds of banquets, brother. With
sorry
plenty of
for interrupting you.
So at this banquet, one of the coolest episodes in the Torah happens. A hand appears and writes on the wall, Menei, Menei, Tekel Ufarsin. He doesn't understand what it means. He doesn't speak that language. And his mother suggests, perhaps you should speak to Daniel, your grandfather and father's advisor, and he'll explain it to you. He was able to read dreams. You tried to throw him in a lion's den. He survived. He's clearly a smart guy. So he asks Daniel, and Daniel explains it means you have been weighed and found wanting, which is a phenomenal, if you want to make fun of someone, it's way better than SOB. You have been weighed.
That's scary.
And found wanting.
I would be, yeah. I would never go to bed.
Devastating. And that tonight, your kingdom will be taken from you and given to the Persian Empire, your enemies. The king immediately became super paranoid. He didn't stop drinking, but he did order his guards to surround the castle. And if anyone tries to leave or come in, kill them. He woke up a couple hours later, a little still drunk, and he went outside to use the outhouse. And as he tried to cross the moat back into the castle, his own men killed him, thinking he was an intruder. Not realizing who they killed, hours later when the Persian army fell upon the capital city, they looked for the king to lead the army and couldn't find him. There was a complete upheaval. No one was sure who should lead, and the Babylonians had a routing victory. They went around killing all the members of the royal family. But Koresh, while searching the palace, found a young girl under the bed. The young girl is the first character of the Purim story we get introduced to, is Vashti, the future queen. And he realizes that the daughter of Belshazzar, the great-granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, one of the greatest kings in history, would be a huge prize for his son. Lineage is everything. And Koresh was well aware, Koresh was well aware that without proper lineage, his son would have other claimants to the throne. So a marriage to the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar was a huge political victory. So he kidnapped this young girl. So again, in the year 3390 we're holding now, Koresh is known as the greatest king and conqueror in the world. In 3391, Koresh's advisors come to him with something no one's ever told any king before. They said, you remember that 70 years that Jeremiah was talking about? It's over now. Now, they were so silly as to think that they were counting from when Nebuchadnezzar conquered the land. No, the 70 years must have started when Jeremiah gave the prophecy, 70 years from today. So for sure now, the 70 years are over. The Jews will never return to their land, and God is leaving it open for you to do whatever you want. Now, Koresh reacts very differently than the king before had. Belshazzar felt that God had not blessed him, that he was fighting God. Koresh had never had a bad day in his life. He was a winner from the first day. I'm not going to compare him to any presidential candidate, but I'm a winner. I love winning. People are going to be sick of winning if they hang out with me. I win, I win, I win, I win, I win. So he said, God must love me. So if God loves me, why would I go against his promise? Instead, he says, I'm going to allow the Jews to return to the temple. He freed Zerubbabel, the scion of the house of David, the rightful king of Israel. And he allowed him to return to Jerusalem with 42,000 men to rebuild the temple. Then the next day, Koresh was not the typical king. He still very much enjoyed various sports of the time, swimming, climbing, wenching, which was a sport back then, which is, I think, we've eliminated from society. But he was a man who lived his life to the lustful fullest. And while diving, he saw something shiny. And if you remember from our chapter earlier, he found the sunken boats of Nebuchadnezzar. And in one day, he doubled his wealth. He immediately saw this for what it was, a reward for God for his kind actions.
So
and
he does keep
doubled
winning
down.
for doing wrong.
Well, this time he actually did right. He allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem.
Well, the dive-in, he was just having a good time, and he doubled his wealth. I wish I could, just go work out.
I've never gone
and
for a
double my
dive and
income.
doubled my wealth.
Never. I found like a $20 bill once. It was counterfeit.
Nowadays, you can
Shouldn't
go
have used
mining
it.
on the internet maybe and double your wealth.
Yeah, double my followers after we post this video.
No, you can go mining on the internet and come across a Bitcoin.
I guess you're right.
You double your wealth.
Yeah, 2 Bitcoins. You're triple your wealth.
Boom. So he's now extremely wealthy, and he doubles down. He sends trees from the mountains of Lebanon to Jerusalem to help with the rebuilding. The Jews celebrated, they praised the Koresh, the king Cyrus, but their joy was not long-lived. In 3392, only a year after he allowed the construction, Koresh passed away. And his successor was his greedy, selfish, evil, and most of the time drunk son, Achashverosh. So we haven't reached the beginning of the Megillah, but we've reached the reign of Achashverosh.
So Anakin Skywalker has been introduced, I guess.
Correct.
I guess he's Anakin. And it is funny because George Lucas did borrow a lot from Judaism. Like Yoda means Yodea. Like Yoda the wise man is Yodea.
Say that this is introducing Anakin. This is introducing adult Anakin.
I guess you're right. So he's a bad guy. So I was born Darth Vader almost.
Almost, yeah.
Because he's just a fun guy, it seems like, Ahasuerus. More so.
So that depiction is often mistaken. The reason Achashverosh gets painted in the Megillah as the benign, fun, kind of swayed the wrong way guy is because he was still king when they wrote it. It's hard to
get in trouble.
publish a book during the reign of a drunkard saying the guy's a drunk jerk.
So it'd be like me publishing a book about by President Chairman Xi in China, while in China, kind of.
Correct. If you wrote a Megillah Putin right now and you were living in Moscow, you'd get a new home next to the other opposition leaders in prison.
Yeah. So he was not a fun guy.
When Esther wrote the Megillah, she painted Achashverosh in as positive a light as possible, and he still doesn't come off smelling like roses. But you can only stretch the truth so far. But the rabbis agree. How long was I muted for?
5 seconds. You said the rabbis agree.
The rabbis agree that Achashverosh was not a positive figure. There's actually a discussion in the first line of the Megillah when it says Achashverosh hu Achashverosh. Is it saying that's the Achashverosh who was so powerful, or that's the Achashverosh who was such a drunk? But either way, they agree he was a wicked man. Now, Achashverosh came to the throne as a young man, but again, he had severe both rightfully, he felt inferior. He wasn't from a long royal line, and he didn't even have the military acumen of his father to deserve the throne. He was a spoiled, drunk kid from a not long-lived dynasty. He was the young son of new money. He didn't even have the old money connections. So, and immediately upon his taking the throne, there were some problems. Some islands rebelled, and there was a group at the time in Israel, the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a tribe that adopted some precepts of Judaism but didn't adopt the Jewish faith. They were constantly at war with the Jews, and when their attacks on Jerusalem failed, they hired a young man from the tribe of Amalek, who went by Memucha, also went by Haman, to be their lobbyist in the court of King Achashverosh. So he came and he said to the king, the Jews are planning a rebellion. They're rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem not for their temple, but to declare their sovereignty and to rebel against you. When he handed in his evidence in writing, he didn't include that. He was afraid to lie on the record, but he had no issue saying it. Achashverosh, who again was paranoid, bought into it 100% and immediately ordered the temple building to stop.
So he went to the press and said that the Jews were planning something secret, but not in court.
No, he went to the king and said it.
Oh.
When he was asked to write his testimony in the written record, he changed his testimony, figuring that the drunk couldn't read.
Just stick it on page 55.
So later that year, in 3393, if we're following along in the years, so for those who are following along in the exact years, 3393 is 368 before the Common Era. We're getting closer. My Zaidi wasn't born yet, but we're getting closer.
My president wasn't born yet either, but we're getting closer.
So Achashverosh had a major rebellion on his hands. One of the large countries, Hodu, what we would call now India, rebelled. So he sent two large armies, each army of 6,000 men. At the time, two men came before him. They were arguing over the land of Israel. One of them was representing the Jews, the youngest member of the Sanhedrin, then in his 80s. Okay, the young buck was 80 at this time. His name was.
So he was around. So he was around during the first temple. If he's 80.
Correct. He was one of the men when Nebuchadnezzar kidnapped the court. He was one of the men of the court.
Wow.
So in his mid-80s, Mordecai is now the representative of the Jews to the king's court. And he begs for permission to continue rebuilding the temple. He says this idea that we're trying to rebel against the king is simply false. Please allow us to rebuild the temple. At the same time, have the other guy, Haman, who came from a very poor family, but is a skilled linguist and has been hired by the Samaritans to represent their interests. He says, no, they're going to rebel. You have to. So Ahasuerus says, very simple. I have a job for the two of you. There's a rebellion in India. Each one of you should raise 6,000 men, go and take down the capital city. And when you do, I'll be happy to hear from you. So he figured, number one, I can delay one of my cases as much as possible and maybe take care of another one. I can kill two birds with one thrown beer bottle. So the two armies take off, one led by Mordecai, one led by Haman, and Mordecai was a disciplined leader who had the respect of his men. Haman did not. Again, we talk about lineage mattering. Mordecai was a descendant of King Shaul, the first king of the Jews. Haman was a barber only several years earlier. Nobody wants to follow a barber into war. And the way that Haman gained his men's trust was by feasting them off the supplies the king had given them. And within a few months, Haman had run out of food. It was supposed to be a 3-year siege. They had planned provisions for 3 years, and Haman had run out of food. It says the only food he had left was pickles, which if you don't have any water stores is a bad food to feed your men in India.
Yeah. Nice.
So he comes to Mordecai. He says, you need my men for the siege. Please give me half your food. And Mordecai says, no, you can't be trusted. You're terrible at giving out food. I can't risk the lives of my own men. So he said, what do we do? So Mordecai said, here's what we'll do. If I can trust you to distribute the food according to my orders so that the food will last, I'll share my rations with you. So here's a deal we'll make. You'll be my slave 1 day a week. And on that day, I'll give you food and you'll distribute it according to my orders. So Haman agreed, and he took off his jambua, his military boot that he wore over his shoes. At that time, armor was worn. Instead of switching out boots, you would put on armor. So you'd have armor pants over your pants, armor chest over your chest, and armor boots over your boots. So he etched into the bottom of the boot, Haman, the son of Hamdasa, will be a slave for Mordecai 1 day a week. They both signed it, and they shared rations. However, with Mordecai's divine blessing, the siege quickly was successful, and this system never fully took place. So although it was a deal they both signed on, it never really took effect.
But it was embarrassing to go from, he went from barber to kind of the leader of a people to back to being a slave. So
yes,
he probably hated
however,
Mordecai.
He never really had to serve Mordecai because the siege ended so quickly.
Yeah.
So this 3-year process where you'd have to come to Mordecai once a week for food never took place. So now we've reached the first line of the Megillah. It's the 3rd year of the reign of Ahasuerus. Okay, he's celebrating for a bunch of reasons. Number one, his wife has finally reached the age of maturity in that country, not in this one. Good Lord. And he married his wife Vashti, who was the most beautiful woman in his eyes in the kingdom, possibly according to anybody. Number two, He reconquered India. His kingdom is now nearly complete. So he has the political stability of being married to the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar now. He has the military stability of having recaptured the lands that rebelled. And lastly, he had finished his capital city because he was afraid of rebellions on all sides. He moved his capital city to a more central location. He called the city Shushan. And to crown the capital city, he built a replica of King Solomon's throne. King Solomon had a phenomenal throne, huge, made of gold, with each step had a predator and prey on it, a lion facing a lamb, a wolf facing a lion facing an ox, a wolf facing a lamb, a tiger facing a camel, an eagle was a peacock, a cat and a rooster, a hawk and a dove. And there were menorahs on each side, carved in with the names of the greatest Jewish leaders. There were seats for advisors. It was a phenomenally gorgeous throne, known throughout the world. And it was famously known that when Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, which actually is named Pharaoh is king and Necho means cripple, because when he tried to climb the throne, the lion, instead of its paw mechanically lifting him, it struck his leg and broke it so badly he could never walk straight again. So he had a replica made and didn't tell anybody. So when he sat on that throne, it seemed that he was both the heir of Koresh, the greatest warrior in modern history, again, modern at that time, of course, married to Vashti, the great-granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, the great conqueror, sitting on the throne of Solomon, the wisest king of all. And as someone, generally people who have inferiority complexes care a lot about appearances. He appeared to be every step a king. But his biggest reason for celebration was this. When Haman returned, remember, he said when Mordecai and Haman return, he's going to rule on what should happen in Jerusalem. Haman came to him with exciting news. He says, no one has ever advised the king this before. But 70 years have gone by since the prophecy of Jeremiah. He said the people who counted in the times of Belshazzar, your father-in-law, were fools. They counted from when the land was captured. And the people who counted in the times of your father were also fools. They were counting from when Jeremiah gave the prophecy. When you should be counting from is when you exiled the king. So not when you conquered the land, and not when the prophecy was made, but when you exiled the king, when you removed the king from Jerusalem, that was the date. That was it.
And was that 3 years off or 4 years off?
Correct. So it was 6 years from the original date now. So now is 70 years. Now the God of Israel has no more power. And this is the party that the Megillah begins with. It speaks of Pharaoh throwing a huge party, while Vashti, a party of decadence, of lust, filled with wine and inappropriate relations, gluttony, and while Vashti, his wife, threw a similar party for the women, a 180-day party. Like any rich kid, Achashverosh didn't realize the value of money and wasted a great deal of the treasury on this.
Yeah, 180 days doesn't seem cheap.
180 days is a long party. And this is the party that the Megillah starts with. So we'll just talk about the first few lines of the Megillah. Once it describes this party with Amudei Sheish, that he built marble columns in the courtyard to make it look more like a palace because he wanted everyone to see his wealth. He allowed everyone to keep the glass they drank from. He gave out gold goblets. Every cup of wine you finished, you got to keep the gold cup, which was a huge incentive to drink more. Imagine if you get to keep a gold cup every time you finish a glass of wine.
Oh, I've been to buffets. I can imagine.
Show
So
me
it's
the
just all you can drink, all you can eat for 180 days.
And then after that 180 days, every king needs a place where they're secure, a capital city. So his capital city is Shushan. So he threw a 7-day feast specifically for the Jews of Shushan, for the people of Shushan. And he invited every member of the city. Now the Jews at this point have been through a washing machine. They dwelled securely in their land under Yechoniah. Then Nebuchadnezzar exiled the king. Then Evil-Madrich gave them some rights back. Then Belshazzar took those rights away. Then Koresh came and allowed them to rebuild the temple. Then Achashverosh rose and removed those rights and oppressed them further. Who do I believe? Who do I trust? The leaders that I remember of leading a free and independent nation are few and far between at this point. Again, it's been over 70 years since our land was conquered. Many of these Jews were born and raised in diaspora.
Most, when you say most,
having been freed.
If it's been 70 years, probably most.
The majority of Jews, yeah, for sure. The majority of Jews were raised in a horrible exile with no hope of returning. This was the point of view of these Jewish people. And they were faced with a tremendous decision. Do we attend the party and show our patriotism, or do we stay loyal to God, as the seventh day of the party was Yom Kippur? It's the middle of the 10 days of repentance, and Yom Kippur is when this party was, which was intentional. Haman, who was a big believer in spirituality, wanted the Jews to betray their Torah.
Wow. So 7-day party. So Shabbos and Yom Kippur.
Correct. Shabbos, the Yom Kippur fell on Shabbos that year. That's how the Megillah begins, with this moral question for the Jewish people. It's the third year of Achashverosh's reign. There is no question that he's an immoral king, that he's a drunk, that he's a lustful, violent king. But it also seems that he's never been more secure. Every country in the world just celebrated with him for 6 months. He's sitting on the throne of David with the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar sitting at his side. He's reconquered any land that rebelled. Is there any chance the Jews have of not attending the party? Is there any way we can reject this offer of the king of friendship?
We could, but they clearly didn't.
So Mordecai, the eldest and wisest of the Jewish leaders, said, do not go to the party. Do not attend the party. Refuse to attend. But sadly, many, many Jews did attend. The wine that was served was non-kosher wine. Interestingly, there were kosher options in the food. The king wanted to be as comfortable as possible, but the wine was not kosher.
Kosher style.
And many drank the non-kosher wine. It was only on the last day of the celebration that the Jews didn't attend because it was Yom Kippur. Now, if we can step into the Megillah for a little bit, for a little more background information, because the real Purim story starts with Esther, the Megillah of Esther. Vashti has been recast in modern dialogue as a feminist hero. It's a completely ignorant of the story point of view. Vashti was a horrid leader, especially to women. During this entire 6 months,
female slaves.
During this entire 6-month party, Vashti was forcing free women into sexual slavery for the pleasure of her husband's guests. She especially enjoyed demeaning Jewish women, specifically making them work on Shabbos, making them work naked, because she knew of the extreme modesty of Jewish women. And the reason that Achashverosh felt so comfortable ordering his wife to appear naked before him was exactly within her character. She thought herself beautiful and was happy to flaunt it without any regard for modesty. In fact, our rabbis teach us the only reason she refused his order this time was because she had grown pimples in a tail. The Torah says Gabriel gave her pimples in a tail to launch this story into happening. What's remarkable is she could have refused and lived. She could have said no, and the king would have accepted it. Someone would have said, hey, Your Majesty, it was probably a stupid idea to invite your wife to come here naked. But it was not in the character of the daughter of Belshazzar to say no. Instead, what she said to her husband was, she told his servants, go publicly tell your stupid king that in the house of my father, Belshazzar, the real king of the world, he wouldn't be good enough to be a stable hand. My father famously could drink enough wine for 1,000 men and not get drunk, while this king has one glass and loses his mind.
So she really picked at his self-consciousness.
So the Megillah shortens this, not to, again, the Megillah does not want to embarrass Achashverosh. Vashti had oppressed other women to such an extent that she made the crucial mistake to believe she wasn't a woman in that society anymore, forgetting she was a woman in Persia 2,300 years ago.
Yeah, not much of a say in terms of court and marriage.
She had joined alongside the men oppressing women for so long, she forgot the political realities of where she was living. And that's when Haman jumps up. Haman's first mention in the Megillah as Memucha. He sees a chance for two things. Number one, political gain. Memuchan was didn't appreciate the reign of Vashti. Vashti didn't uplift her own people, and he didn't like that. He said, if she goes down, other advisors will go up. Maybe I can be one of them. Number two, Haman's wife was an awful human being. And he said, if the king now establishes that the man rules the house, maybe my wife will fall more into line as well.
Wow.
Something we typically find from hateful men, that they're also weak men who can't establish a healthy relationship with their wives. And the only way he could impose what he believed was order in his relationship was by having it artificially maintained from the outside. So he told the king, not only should you kill your wife, you should make a law that forever every wife should have to obey and bend to his will. And if the wife disobeys in any way, she should immediately be killed. This law comes into play later in the Purim story, when we talk about Esther's sacrifice of going before the king, knowing full well that this hateful, misogynistic laws of Haman was still in effect, that she could be killed for coming before her husband without permission. And that launches us into the Purim story. You now have a king who's alone, depressed, angry, and less stable on the throne than he was a month ago, even more paranoid, seeking someone to stabilize his kingdom, seeking someone that when sitting next to him, makes him appear as more of a king.
And this was not a galaxy far, far away. This was planet Earth. And we were doing the math earlier. It was 2000. We're not going to do the math here. But thank you so much, Rabbi Litvin. And for the full story.
355 before the Common Era.
And for the full story, hit up your synagogue nearest you and hear that Megillah.
Yes, and anyone who is looking to hear the full story on Purim, go to Chabad.org, for example. There's hundreds of ways to hear it in a safe way in person, as the Torah advises us to, commands us to.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi. And please follow Rabbi Litvin on Clubhouse as well. Got to get your followers up. And it's been such a great time. And thanks so much for giving the context for the Purim story.
Thank you.
And God bless.